Welcome. Today I'm going to share how I replaced the radiator in our 2010 Camry. The plan for the day changed when I noticed a small puddle of antifreeze under our car. With a quick examination of the car, we found coolant leaking out of the lower horizontal seam of the radiator.
Recently we've noticed, initially we noticed we were losing some engine heat. And that's a sure sign of low coolant, and sure enough it was low coolant.
With a failed radiator identified as the problem, I wanted to better understand why it failed. The first thing I checked for was electrolysis. Electrolysis damage in an engine cooling system is caused by unintended electrical currents that flow from voltage differences that exist in the engine coolant jacket, the radiator, and the heater core. The damage can include rapid corrosion, pitting, flaking, and pinholes. It is relatively easy to check for electrolysis. Using a voltmeter on a DC scale, you place the positive lead of the meter in the engine coolant without touching the radiator sides, and then clamp the negative lead on the battery ground.
So I have the negative on the battery terminal and the positive in the coolant. What do we got?
0.12.
So that does not qualify as electrolysis. We're looking for 0.4 or higher, which means the coolant is good.
Yeah.
So we'll do one more test. We'll get the engine running. I'll leave it running for 20 minutes and with the radiator cap off, and we'll check this one more time.
For the test to be valid, there needs to be an electrical load. The normal electrolysis reading for a cooling system is 0.4 volts or less.
0.05, 0.06, 0.07, 0.08, 0.09.
So what's your analysis?
It's way less than 0.4.
Agreed. So the coolant isn't the problem, but the radiator has failed.
If it's greater than 0.4 volts, the electrolysis additives are exhausted, and you may be in the market for a new radiator. With different electrical components turned on, one by one, we never exceeded 0.1 volts. So electrolysis wasn't the cause of the failure, and therefore I do not need to seek out a poor ground on a particular accessory prior to replacing the radiator.
Okay, let's swap it out.
I started by removing the two plastic panels from the bottom of the Camry and then drained the coolant. Up top, the first item to remove are the two bolts holding the air intake in place and the 6 10mm bolts that hold the top radiator frame assembly. 8 10mm bolts in all. The top 4 are easily accessible. The two tucked away on the edge can be accessed with a 10mm wrench. Next, we will remove the upper radiator hose and tie it back.
There we go. All right.
Here's a close-up of the last two of the original 8 10mm bolts. They attach the upper radiator frame assembly to the lower radiator frame assembly. That's a little bit awkward. Here I'm reaching from underneath to disconnect one of the two horns. I have chosen to leave the horns bolted in place, but to disconnect the electrical wires from them. This is a poor shot of me removing the last of the original 8 10mm bolts. This one can only be accessed from underneath. It's hidden in front of the hood latch. With all 8 10mm bolts removed and the wires disconnected from the two horns, the upper radiator frame assembly should be removable. Notice how the hood latch and cable are still intact, and you will see the two horns are still attached. Next, we need to disconnect the electrical from the two electric fans, also removing the wiring from the harness clips. Next, I'm removing the tube connecting the radiator to the radiator reserve tank. Next, I remove the condenser from the front of the radiator. The Camry's AC condenser is bolted to the radiator with just 4 10mm bolts, 2 up top and 2 down below. Off camera, down below, I'm removing the bottom radiator hose. This was not difficult because the clamp was rusted right through. It literally fell off. One more plastic clamp mounted to the fan assembly that holds the lower radiator hose in place.
Is there a strap? Oh, there's a strap. One more strap holding the big hose on. Let's let go of that one somehow. So we got a big opening there now. The two hoses that I do have connected, one here and one here, appear to be connected to this radiator, which I think is called a condenser.
Next thing to do is to place the two radiators side by side and swap over all the accessories that you will need. For starters, the two fans and the rubber mounts. The lower radiator rubber mount may have come out with the radiator, or it may still be with the car. In my case, one came out and one is still sitting in the vehicle. Now I'm going to pause the video here for a second. Notice there is a difference between my old radiator and my new one. The new one has two extra 3/8-inch copper pipes attached to the bottom of the unit. I believe these are for transmission cooling, perhaps part of a towing package. In any event, our Camry doesn't need these transmission cooling lines, so I will just leave them capped, as you see here, and not connect them. Prior to installing the new radiator, I wanted to flush it out once with water to remove any foreign matter introduced during manufacturing. Here's the new radiator ready to be installed. I don't know if there is a knack to this or not. If there is, I don't know it. What I can share is you need to have the two fans installed on the radiator before you slide it in, because there is no way to do it later. Reattaching the AC condenser to the front of the radiator, 4 10mm bolts. Installing the two rubber radiator mounts, which I pulled off the old unit. Reattaching the lower radiator hose and using a new hose clamp. Reattaching the hose from the radiator reserve tank to the radiator. Reconnecting both electrical connections to the two fans. Reconnecting the upper radiator hose to the radiator. Once again, I used a new hose clamp. Rather than completing the installation, I thought I would start to add coolant now, as it does take time to fill. And while it was filling, I would continue assembly. The fluid sort of burps in. It doesn't happen quickly. I've already reconnected the right horn line. Unfortunately, I damaged the left horn line during disassembly, so I'm fixing my damage here by installing a new connector. Time to reinstall the upper radiator frame assembly. 8 bolts in total.
Okay. Now how does that work? Does that go behind or in front? I think it goes like that. There we go. Okay, radiator is through there. It's lining up pretty good. I have 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here, and then the air intake. So 2, 4, 6, 8 bolts.
With assembly complete, I wanted to start the engine and bring it up to temperature to burp the coolant line. Burping is done with the radiator cap removed. You wait for the car to warm up so the thermostat opens, and then the pressure of the expanding coolant being heated drives the air out. Keep adding coolant as needed. With the engine at operating temperature and the coolant topped up, all I have left to do is to reinstall the plastic aerodynamic panels under the front of the Camry. So to recap, this is not a difficult job. And you need very few tools. It might take 3 hours from start to finish. And if you've done this before, I bet you could swap out a radiator in 60 minutes. I hope you found this helpful. Cheers.